Hello everyone, today I'm taking on the rather ambitious task of teaching you everything you need to know about image editing in Lightroom in one single video. So this is targeted at beginner and intermediate photographers, but maybe advanced photographers will be able to find something of interest in here as well. Now I do like to promote these simpler techniques because they allow you to really focus on what needs doing to an image, the creative side of things, as opposed to the tool set. In the 12 years or so that I've been editing images using Adobe packages and other plugins and so on, I've come across some incredibly complex techniques, and many of my peers use those techniques to great effect, but it's really confusing for the beginner, and to be honest, most of those techniques don't really create any meaningful benefit. So it's sort of a complex way of doing something that could be achieved much more simply using the simpler tools that are available in Lightroom. Unsurprisingly, Adobe engineers are actually pretty good at making software tools. So I am going to keep it simple, and hopefully your edits will be better as a result, not worse. I could actually probably do a lot better by teaching you the most complex techniques that I'm aware of and claiming that they're going to give your images the X factor and create clickbait titles, and of course there is a lot of that going on, but that's not really the kind of photographer I am. And I should probably say that actually there's a load of great information already on YouTube from photographers with really brilliant editing styles who know exactly how these tools are used, but maybe you'll enjoy my insights to them all the same. So this video is really targeted at people with an editing style that's comparable to mine. So I would say that I shoot and edit in an eyewitness style, which means that my images very strongly represent the scene that I was actually photographing, the scene that was in front of me. And those photos obviously have the ability to sort of transport the viewer to the location and maybe give them a sense of what you're experiencing at the time. And for me, that's the power of photography. That's why I pursue that style. That's why I find those images exciting. So what I'm not covering in this video is any of the kind of edits that would create fantastical scenes, so stretching mountains and dropping in skies and all that sort of stuff, or stylized scenes. So whether you want to create a particular film look, a cross-process style, or whatever it might be, changing the colors of the scene to create a certain feel. Again, that's a perfectly valid approach, but it's not one that I take, and it's not one that I will be teaching. So I am going to bring up an example of the style of image I'd like to champion, and this is a photo by Hsl. It's taken in Namibia this year, but it could be any year. It's a timeless photo. It's very much what he was seeing at the time. We can imagine being there very easily. But it brings out all of the beautiful qualities of the scene, whether it's the lovely soft ripples in the sand in the foreground, or the variation in the banding of light in the midground over those lovely grasses, to the subtle haze partially obscuring the mountain but generating some depth, and those lovely cloud structures above the scene. So I think it's an absolutely stunning image and the kind of style that many photographers could aspire to. So that's the kind of thing that we're trying to achieve, but I am going to introduce a far more complex example just so that people can't say, but what about this kind of crazy high contrast scene? We're going to handle a crazy high contrast scene just so that you can see the full range of techniques. And with that said, that's plenty of waffling, so let's get started. So before I launch into an image edit, I'm actually going to talk through all of the tools that are available to us in this Lightroom Develop panel, because for the uninitiated, it's a pretty daunting collection of tools here. You've just got an enormous amount of control and really no idea how to tackle this. It's not helped by the fact that these controls at the top are called the basic controls, when actually they're very powerful. This is where we should be spending most of our time, in my opinion. So I'm actually going to skip this panel, and we're going to go through the others one by one, and I'm going to tell you mostly why you don't need to use them at all. Now, there'll be some of you watching this who find certain controls that I'm going to say are useless, very useful for your specific workflow. That's not to invalidate your own approach, but I'm trying to create a process here that beginners can use so that they can focus on the thought processes rather than the tools. And these are also the approaches that I use myself. So I'm not just trying to simplify things just to make things easy on everybody. I actually think that these are the best methods as well. So firstly, we're going to talk about the tone curve, and this is a particularly scary thing if you're not familiar with curves, and particularly hard to describe in Lightroom because the axes of this graph are not labeled. but enough to say that basically if you push this line up, the image gets brighter, and if you push it down, it gets darker. And if you push different areas of the curve around in different ways, you can, for example, create contrast, as I have done here. This is what you would call an S-curve. So this is a method of controlling the tones of your image, and actually all of that control is essentially replicated in these basic controls. So for example, the contrast slider essentially creates an S-curve, and you can see that it has a very similar visual effect. The blacks and white sliders do similar things to the top and bottom end of the curve. So you can look at my video on those sliders in the Photographer's Geek Out if you really want to know about those. But fundamentally, I'm going to say that you don't need the tone curve because you just don't need to duplicate the control that you already have in the basic panel. It does give you control over the color channels individually as well. But as you can see, that's something that you certainly don't want to get into if you're a beginner, because things look horrible pretty quickly. So I'm going to collapse the tone curve panel because I don't think we need to discuss it any further. And I will be doing videos in the future on curves, but this is not the place to go through that. Next up, we've got HSL, hue, saturation, luminance. I've got all selected here so that you can see all of the controls at once, but you can actually change the way that these controls are organized. They will still do exactly the same thing, but I've just got all of them open here just so that they're in one convenient panel, but you can open these sub selections as well. So what the HSL sliders do is allow you to change particular color ranges in particular ways. So for example, here we've got some oranges in these leaves on the trees. So we can make the oranges redder by using this slider here, or we could reduce their saturation almost completely or boost their saturation, which you probably don't want to do to that extent, or we can change their brightness using this luminance slider. And there are some controls here that might be useful. For example, they can be useful for a slight hue tweak. So for example, if you felt that the camera raw file was just rendering those yellows and oranges a bit too yellow in the foliage there, then you might just take the yellow slider, for example, and just make it slightly more orange and just do tiny little tweaks like this. I very rarely do that myself with my own work. The one thing I will do occasionally is try to darken bits of blue sky very slightly using the blue and aqua sliders here. So you can actually see that happening in the water and in the sky. If you use that too heavy-handedly, then you end up with artifacts. But broadly speaking, I don't think you need to worry about this yet. You need a pretty keen eye for color to start shifting hues around. So actually I'm going to close this one down as well, and just know that it's there if you need to control colors locally. Next up is the detail panel, and to be honest, you can pretty much leave this untouched for the vast majority of images, assuming that you've managed to get a sharp shot in the first place. Now, if you do have motion blur or some general softness in the image, then you might want to increase the sharpening. So you would zoom into your image like this, and then just drag the slider off to the right until things look sharp. One thing I will say is that lots of beginners over sharpen their images. They do something like this and they don't realize that they're kind of destroying the subtlety of textures and edges and so on. Edges are not supposed to be razor sharp like this. They are supposed to have a nice continuity to them. So don't overdo it with the sharpening like that. And if your image is soft due to motion blur or being slightly out of focus, then you might consider also increasing the radius. I wouldn't play around with these detail sliders, and the masking slider maybe in some cases. So if you see a lot of noise in your sky, for example, I mean, there's only a little bit here, then you could use the masking tool to make sure that the sharpening doesn't affect the sky. So that's the sharpening settings. And by default, they actually do a very good job of sharpening an already sharp file. The noise reduction can more or less be set as it is. If you're shooting high ISO images, then maybe you need to focus on that side of things a bit more, but I'm going to skip that here because I don't think that that's amazingly relevant to most photographers. So we're going to forget about the detail panel as well, because I'm assuming that you've got sharp shots, but if you do need to sharpen, that's the place to do it. In terms of lens corrections, we actually have one checkbox here that we're going to check all the time, and that's the remove chromatic aberration box. This image actually doesn't have any chromatic aberration, but if you have it, you'll see it as blue or green on one edge and red on the other. So it's sort of a color shift either side of a high contrast edge. You always want that to be removed. It will never harm your images, so I recommend just leaving that checkbox ticked all the time. And actually, if you can set it up as an import preset, all the better. I've actually got a video showing you how to do that if you're interested. The rest of the settings we don't need to worry about as landscape photographers. So yes, we can enable profile corrections, and you can see it undoes the distortion of the lens and removes a little bit of vignetting. You see it's identified the lens that I used here, but actually it's just not really useful for the majority of landscape photographs, because these kind of distortions just don't manifest themselves in any problematic way in images that don't have any perfectly straight lines. So occasionally you might see it with an ocean horizon, for example, where you've put the horizon right at the top of the frame. You might see a slight bit of barrel distortion, and then you can check that box and it'll correct those things. But for the vast majority of scenes, you would just never even see the difference between the corrected and uncorrected if you saw them side by side. Obviously, you can see it when you check and uncheck the button. But aside from checking that box there, you really don't need to worry about this lens corrections thing at all. And the same with the transform tools. This is really a means of controlling perspective. So it's particularly useful for architectural photographers who might need a slight perspective shift. You lose a lot of your image if you do a major perspective shift, but basically you draw on wherever straight lines were in your image that you wanted to be vertical, and it'll do a distortion to correct those lines so that they do appear vertical. Obviously, you never want to do that kind of thing with a landscape, so you don't need to worry about this upright tool here. And similarly, these are just manual ways of controlling the same kinds of perspective shifts. So you can do some pretty funky stuff, but it really isn't that useful for landscape photography, so we can completely forget that one. Then on to effects. Well, you can add vignetting here in various ways. You certainly don't want to do a white vignette, but maybe you want to darken the edges of your frame. And this is an easy way to do it. But personally, I would avoid using this panel at all. And if you want to do vignetting, try and do it manually using these local adjustments. And I will discuss how these local adjustments work. But hopefully once you've understood that, you can understand how you might paint in a vignette if you really wanted to do that. In terms of my own edit, I tend to just add an effective vignette to the top edge of the frame when I've got a bright sky, so just to hold the eye in. So I'll just drag a gradient over the top, but I don't tend to add any vignetting to the sides of the images. So we can forget about that panel too. Next up, it's color grading, which unsurprisingly is for color grading your images. This is a new introduction to Lightroom of, I think, the end of last year it was introduced. And the idea here is that you can recreate various aesthetics that might be associated with film photography or even film cinema. So a classic look would be the orange teal shift. So you would move your shadows into the sort of tealy kind of colors, cyans maybe. And then you would move your midtones or highlights into warmer tones, and you get this sort of faded kind of weird look. But obviously you can control these in a whole variety of different ways and be very, very creative with them. Some people are really talented at this kind of color grading and achieving particular looks by moving these bits around, and some of the other controls that I'll discuss in a second. That's not something that I get involved with at all. And unless you want to create those kinds of looks to your images, you just don't need this panel. So we're going to forget about that one as well. And finally, we're onto this calibration panel here. So this will allow you to shift colors in various ways across the whole image. And actually, it's a way that you could perform hue shifts in quite a realistic way. So I think a lot of people use this panel when they want to make autumn colors look incredibly spectacular. So you can really shift these things around. I very rarely come in here and tweak things, but you can see just how dramatically you can shift these colors from yellows into oranges and reds, and it seems to look fairly realistic. I personally wouldn't recommend doing that as a beginner, especially because it's really quite a powerful tool, and I think you're likely to get into more trouble using those than solving problems. So we can forget about that one as well. And we're pretty much just left with this basic panel and that one checkbox in the lens corrections there. So this is the panel that we're going to focus all our time on, and conveniently it's actually organized kind of in a similar way to the way you should really work through these controls. So I'm going to talk through them one by one, and we'll start with white balance. White balance is very important. I've produced 2 videos on this because I think a lot of people completely forget that white balance makes a lot of difference to color. So I would suggest watching those separate videos so that you understand white balance. But quite commonly I will set my images to around 5400 Kelvin in the warmth, and then +5 because I know that's neutral for the tint slider, and that will do a pretty good job for most of my daylight images as opposed to relying on the auto white balance from the camera. The exposure and contrast sliders should be fairly self-explanatory. So the exposure slider will actually perfectly replicate what would have been the result had you exposed your image brighter by a stop, for example, as we see here, or underexposed by a stop as we see there. So that's obviously quite a powerful control in that you can very significantly shift your exposure very quickly. So that is one that I use pretty regularly to just make small adjustments to exposure, because quite often my exposures are off by half a stop or something like that for various reasons, sometimes intentionally and sometimes not. So that's a useful correction. Contrast, of course, adds contrast to your image. Very, very obvious. What you might not know is that the contrast slider adds mid-tone contrast specifically. So it will make colors look more colorful and generally add contrast to the middle tones of your image, but it actually reduces the contrast of the extreme highlights and shadows. So just something to be aware of there. I've produced 2 videos on these highlights and shadow sliders and the blacks and whites sliders if you really want to get into the detail of these. Personally, I would focus most of your attention on these 4 sliders in combination. So for example, with this image, the sky is fairly blown out, so I would darken the highlights and it's going to locally darken that area. And then I might lift the foreground area because it looks a little bit underexposed. So I'm going to use the shadows sliders to do that. And in doing so, I've actually reduced the contrast. So I'm going to add some additional contrast to fight off the loss of contrast from using those 2 sliders. And then I'm going to see if the exposure is going to help me at all, because maybe I can actually make this a little bit brighter. And the sky looks too bright still, so I'm going to darken these highlights. And so you can see that there's a bit of a dance here that happens where I go back and forth between these various controls until I have an image that broadly looks right. So there is a back and forth, and don't use these just in isolation and think that you can do one and then the other and then the other and never go back, because you will really benefit from going back and readjusting things. The whites and black sliders can sort of be used to set white and black points in the image. Certainly when you've got a nicely exposed shot with a histogram that's pretty much distributed across the entire scene, then this would be a perfectly good way of setting a bit of a white point and making the blacks a little blacker. It's not as good as using the tone curve to do that or doing it separately in Photoshop. But if you just tweak things subtly using these whites and blacks, then it's perfectly fine. And you may even find situations where you might want to darken the whites, for example, to improve the contrast in highlights. And that might allow you to add more contrast elsewhere and so on. These presence sliders get chronically overused by beginners, and that's because they look pretty good on the face of it. So if I zoom into this mountain here, which is stack poly, as some of you may already know, I can see what's going on with these sliders. So the texture slider here was actually created to smooth skin textures. So it's a portraiture tool initially, but if you push it to the right, you can add texture, which we might be tempted to do as landscape photographers. And you can see as you do that, you bring out the rocks and the grasses, and there's much better separation and micro contrast in there, much more detail apparently, but it looks pretty terrible when you zoom out. So maybe you would reduce the amount that you've applied that slider just so that it's helping you. But actually my experience is when I look at people who've used either of these sliders, the texture or the clarity, it just looks 50% terrible if they use it 50% of the way, as opposed to 100% terrible if they use it all the way. So, I mean, really, unless you're just doing the slightest tweak of these sliders here, I would avoid them completely. And for your reference, I don't use them at all. I literally don't use them at all. I have very, very occasionally used the clarity slider on clouds, but even that I wouldn't now do using the clarity slider. I just don't think you need these at all, these presence sliders. The dehaze, maybe there's some slight use here because it's actually quite an effective way of cutting through haze with many scenes. It's actually quite an intelligent tool, so it does identify haze fairly well. If you use it heavily, then you'll ruin your images, but if you use it subtly, it can really help you along. And that's the kind of approach that you probably want to take with a lot of your edits, just making subtle improvements here and there. Finally, everybody loves a bit of saturation, but actually when you've done your highlights and shadows changes and added a bit of contrast, that contrast change actually adds saturation already. So you may find that the level of saturation of your images is absolutely fine without even touching these sliders. If you do need to saturate, I would recommend using the vibrant slider because it saturates less saturated colors more than it saturates very saturated colors, and that's useful because it stops the colors looking terrible. So you can actually achieve a lot of additional saturation with this vibrant slider, whereas the saturation slider very quickly looks bad because the already saturated colors very quickly become far too saturated. So I wouldn't use the saturation slider for saturation. I would use the vibrant slider, and if you want to desaturate, then I would use the saturation slider. So that's a good way of kicking the life out of overly vibrant colors. So that's the basic panel, and I cannot emphasize enough that this is where you should be spending your time, particularly as a beginner, because these controls are so powerful. They are the difference between great image edits and poor image edits, and a lot of the other controls will just progressively ruin your photographs. So I would really focus on these foundational aspects. They're so important, and yes, they might be quick and simple and easy to apply, but they produce amazing results. So please do focus your time here. And in combination with these local controls, you can do pretty much whatever you want. So I'm going to talk you through just a couple of tools here first. So there's the crop tool, which does what it says on the tin. You can move this around. This was a panorama originally, as you can see, which is why you've got these bowed edges, and I'll show you how to make a panorama in a second. But you can shift the crop corners around to wherever you want, and you can also constrain to specific aspect ratios using this drop down here. So we could set 16:9, for example, and we can unlock that aspect ratio if we then want to free it up again to change the shape of the frame. So I am just going to widen this back out again. So that's the crop tool, and you can also change the angle, so you can straighten an image that isn't quite level by just dragging around outside the corner of the frame there, or by using that slider. So that's actually a very well designed tool that's very quick and easy to use. Then there's the spot removal tool, which does what it says on the tin. You can use it to clone things out if you really want to, though I wouldn't recommend cloning anything out, especially when you're starting out, other than dust spots. So I can't see any dust spots on this image, I'm afraid. I probably did have a very clean sensor at the time, but let's say this rock was a dust spot just here. So you just click on it and it will find a matching area, and if you want to, you can drag the area that it's referencing around until you get a better match, and it should kind of smooth things out. And you can see it's done a pretty good job there of getting rid of, I think actually it's probably a tree stump by the looks of it. So that's the spot removal tool. The Photoshop tools are a bit better, but quite honestly, if you want to keep things simple, these tools combined with moving those spots around usually do a pretty good job. Finally, on to the local adjustments, and we have three ways of making changes locally to an image. There's the gradient filter, the radial filter, and the brush tool. So the gradient filter works by essentially just dragging across the image, and you can see these bars appear. The central bar is the area where 50% of that adjustment is applied. Above the top bar, 100% of the adjustment will be applied, and below the bottom bar, 0% of the adjustment will be applied. And so just to do something really extreme here, here's a massive darkening adjustment. So anywhere above this line, the adjustment is applied in full, and anywhere below this bottom line, it isn't applied at all, with a sort of gradient in between, hence the name of the filter. And you'll see that these controls that you have here are essentially a duplicate of what you see on the basic panel. And there are a few extras tacked on to the bottom here, the sharpness tools and so on, which you can use locally if you want to. But again, it's this collection of tools here and the white balance tools that you really want to focus your time on. So in the case of this image, I would just locally reduce the exposure in that top corner to bring back more detail and color into that sky, and make sure it's a lovely soft gradient so that you can't see where it's applied to the image. So it's an incredibly powerful tool, this gradient tool, because you can apply such soft adjustments over huge areas of the image but without affecting other areas. So that's the gradient tool, and actually the other two are actually just duplicates of these same adjustments, but with various refinements. So in this case you can basically apply the effect to the this central circle, and so let's make a really extreme adjustment here, and you can feather it as desired to make that adjustment soft or incredibly hard, which of course you would never really want to do. But that could be a good way of applying certain adjustments. Actually, myself, I don't use the radial tool at all, ever. I've tended to just use the gradient tool or the paintbrush tool, but it's a perfectly good tool. There's nothing wrong with using it whatsoever. Finally, the paintbrush tool. So this will allow you to paint in a much more localized area for adjustment. So let's say that we wanted to just brighten up this little bit of the tree here that's looking a little bit dark, and maybe this branch just here. And then we could apply this brightening adjustment. You can see those areas just slightly being brightened. Maybe we can do it to this bit of tree as well here. So that's what the brush tool is for. The same controls once again, but this time you can control the size of the brush and paint in different areas, and you can also control the hardness of the brush. If you do come across any problems, then you have the ability to erase what you've done. So let's say I painted an absolutely insane adjustment here over the top of the mountain, and I was like, oh no, I don't want that, but for some reason I do want it in the trees. Then you can just paint it away, and it all does a pretty good job. So that's one way of refining the mask. Another way is to use this range mask, and I don't want this to get too long, so if you do want to understand these luminosity masking things, I have produced a video on it. Personally, I don't think they're that useful, but the option is there if you want to prevent these adjustments from affecting certain tonal ranges. So that's a complete overview of all of the tools in the Lightroom Develop panel. Again, just try and keep things as simple as possible. And I'm now going to show you just how powerful these tools are and these simple approaches in editing quite a complex file. I've just pressed the G key to move us into the grid view in the library module here. So we've just quickly stepped out of the develop module so that I can show you these frames. And I've selected them firstly because somebody said in the comments that they'd pay for me to explain my panorama workflow to them, so I'm going to do that for free in the next 10 minutes here, and also because this is quite a challenging scene for a couple of reasons. Firstly, we're looking into the light with lots of saturated colors, so there's lots of contrast, and we also have a color cast where the haze here is being lit by a blue sky behind me, but also it's just an utterly spectacular scene, so the pressure is really on to make this look good. It's not a shot that you want to be discarding. too readily. But before we get on with the edit, I'm just going to give you a bit of a backstory here, because this was at the end of an 18-day backpacking trip continuously in South Greenland in 2015. It's still the most challenging trip I've ever taken on, both physically and mentally. And I did it with my friend Hsl. And 3 days before taking this photo on our very final morning, I actually rolled my pack raft. And I'd taken 2 cameras backpacking with me, 2 full SLR camera systems, in fact, one to shoot time-lapse and one to shoot stills. And I saw the potential of this morning to produce the opening time-lapse for my film, which ultimately it did. And so at this point, my camera was locked up into shooting that time-lapse, and I'll just quickly show you it, because you can see this rather lovely sunrise unfold. It really was a stunning morning. But because I then didn't have a camera, Hsl was kind enough to lend me his only camera, his 5D Mark III, which I rushed to use to take this panorama because I didn't want to deny him too much shooting time. But of course, that was very kind of him, because the light like this really doesn't last very long at all. So that was the backstory, and very glad to have a kind friend like that to lend me his camera. So we're going to select all 6 of these, and we're going to right click, and we're going to select Photo Merge and HDR Panorama. And we're selecting HDR Panorama because we've got an exposure bracketed panorama here. So we've got a bright exposure and a dark exposure, and then 3 frames wide to create this panorama. But you could select HDR if you just had a bracketed set, or you could select Panorama if you just have a panorama of the same exposure. But we need HDR Panorama. And here you can see a preview of the file stitched together. So this gives us an idea of exactly how this will all come together. I would recommend using this spherical projection almost always, because it's going to give you the most realistic scaling of your subjects across the center of the frame. The cylindrical option will generally stretch mountains a little bit, which is why I really dislike it. I don't like that kind of inaccuracy in my images. And the perspective one, if it works, which it sometimes doesn't, no, it hasn't here, it will really very significantly distort your image, but it might be good for architectural shots. So we are also going to use this boundary warp slider here. So you can see that pulls the corners out. We actually started in a place where the corners were bowed in. That's because in order to stitch the images together, the software needs to correct the rectilinear correction that the lens has applied. And I don't want to waste your time just in this video explaining exactly what that is, but needless to say, if you slide that one there, then it will pull those corners back out. And often that produces good results, but you do have to be careful that you don't end up with bowed horizons. So do be careful with that slider. Make sure you're actually watching what's happening. We don't want to use any auto crop or auto settings, but this create stack is handy in just keeping organized, because it will hide all of these component images behind that final panorama. So we then just click merge and it does its magic. Here's the completed panorama, and if we press the D key, that takes us into the develop panel. And if I press I quickly, you'll see that -hdr-pano.dng has been appended to one of the file names. So we know that it's an HDR panorama file, but I do want to make the point that there's nothing particularly special about this workflow that I'm about to show you. It would be applied exactly the same, regardless of whether it was a single exposure in camera or whether you were working with an HDR file or a panorama file. Whatever it is, they're all just raw files, and the tools are exactly the same. So please don't think that this is a workflow that's specific to panoramas, because it absolutely isn't. So firstly, let's try and change the white balance, because this was shot on auto white balance and the camera has corrected for the blue color cast naturally in the scene. And it's also corrected for the magenta color cast, which of course we want, those lovely purple colors of the sunrise. So +5 is about neutral for most Canon cameras, and I'm sure this one is no different. And if I set the temperature here, let's go for about 5,500. I don't need to be absolutely exact there, but around there should give a neutral daylight kind of white balance. Now, I need to be able to see what I'm actually doing, and we've got a massive amount of contrast here. So before I even go into the exposure and contrast, I'm just going to arbitrarily crush the highlights and boost the shadows, and we can kind of see what's going on a little better here. And if I look at this cloud, you can actually see there's a weird peachy color, which may or may not be particularly clear on YouTube. But there's a sort of flat peachy colored area here that suddenly transitions into a magenta. So sometimes when you have intensely bright colors and certain channels are clipping in strange ways, then you need to change the color profile to fix that. And that's what we're going to do here by clicking on that color profile and clicking browse. And usually when I have these problems, I find that it's the faithful profile that gives me the best results. So I'm just going to select that one. But by all means, explore the different profiles that you have available to you and see what they can do for you. Then if we click close and zoom out, then we've fix that problem and we can get on with our editing. So the first thing you might notice is that because we've used these sliders, there's a lack of contrast. It all looks a bit flat and artificial. So we are going to add some contrast back in. And maybe now the mountains are just getting a tiny bit too dark. Now remember that these are in shadow, so they're not supposed to be incredibly bright. You know, we don't want the mountains to look like this. That just looks really weird. So we want to keep them dark, but maybe not quite as dark as they were. So maybe somewhere around here is about right. And I'm being very precise with how I move these final adjustments, because I did the rough adjustments, and now I can really get in there and fine tune what I'm doing. So I am moving back and forth and making sure everything looks just right. So actually, I think we can probably get away with darkening the highlights right down, although maybe that's starting to introduce some fringing. And whilst I'm talking about that, let's just check that lens correction, the chromatic aberration box is checked. We'll do that whilst we remember. Usually my import preset would take care of that, so I do tend to forget it now, but it wasn't in the case of this file. So this is already starting to look quite good, and quite frankly, if you stopped here as a beginner, then it wouldn't be so bad at all. It's still absolutely beautiful. But if we're taking a professional approach to this, then I would focus on various areas of the image and try to improve them locally in different ways. So one thing that really jumps out at me is this really bright area of blue sky near the horizon. Obviously that is natural, but it's a little bit distracting. So what I'm going to do is try to calm that down a bit by painting in an adjustment. So I've selected the brush tool up here, and I'm going to paint in, let's just preset it to about -0.5 a stop. And I've got a lovely soft brush here, so you can see those two rings are quite far apart and it's a large size. I'm using the bracket keys to change the size of the brush. But if you want to change all of those things yourself using sliders, then all those controls are there on the right. So we can now paint in this adjustment and watch as we go to see how it affects things. And you can see it bring out a bit of cloud structure here and there as well. There's areas where we might want this effect to be applied and areas where we might not, but I'm going to try and apply it in all the areas I think that are going to benefit. And I can see that maybe it's slightly darkened a bit too much here and maybe there. So let's just erase some of that. So I click erase here on the right, and let's select a fairly large brush and maybe turn the flow down so that it doesn't totally remove the effect as we paint this in, because I just want to slightly remove it in some of these areas that got a bit too dark. So maybe just there as well. So this is an iterative process, and actually we can go in again and maybe paint this at a lower opacity so we can turn the flow down here. So it's only going to paint it 50% as we move through, and just try and get some of these local areas a bit more specifically. So if I just delete that adjustment, you can see that's before and that's after. So we've really calmed down that bright white area in the sky. And actually that's slightly reflected in the water down below, which I think is going to be a problem when I start brightening the foreground, which is our next step, because the whole bottom half of the image does just look a little bit too bright. And what we don't want to do is brighten the tops of the mountains. We kind of want to retain that contrast between the naturally bright sky here and these dark shadows. But we can probably get away with a slight transitional brightness change into the foreground just so that we can see into these shadows a bit more. So I'm going to drag a very soft edged gradient tool here. So it's basically a gradient that's occurring between the top line that you see there and the bottom line. So it's very soft indeed. And in fact, if I make a massive adjustment, you can see just how soft that is. But we're just going to make a fairly small adjustment, let's say a bit more than half a stop. So we're just brightening in this area, and it starts to look a little bit washed out. So I'm going to add some contrast too. And we can go back and forth just the same as we did with those primary global adjustments that happened across the entire image, just to fine tune these in combination. And obviously the more contrast we add, the more we can reveal these textures. And that does enhance that blue a little bit. So maybe because we've enhanced the color cast, we can just fight it off a little bit with a slight warming adjustment here. And now we have had this problem that I suggested we probably would, which is that the water here is far too bright compared to the sky above it. So we're actually going to use the same process to paint over this reflection, just so that it's not distractingly bright. So just darkening down by a similar amount there. And again, because we used a soft brush, you can't really see any problems with the inaccuracy with which we painted that in. We just covered the area fairly approximately, but it hasn't caused us any problems at all because the adjustment is so small and the brush is soft edged. So now we're getting to a point that it's almost finished and I start to get a little bit particular about the kinds of changes I might make. One of them is I'm going to try and hold the eye in a bit at the top of the frame by just adding effectively a vignette. So I'm actually going to set a slightly diagonal gradient here because I don't want to over darken this cloud on the left here. And then we're just doing a slight darkening adjustment. So just holding the brightness down at the very top of the frame there so that the eye doesn't drift out or get distracted by the brightness at the top of the frame. So that's a nice little trick, if you like, just to help with the visual impact. And maybe we can bring out a bit more of the structure in this part of the sky here. So let's paint in a big soft adjustment here. And I'll just have a play around with these adjustments in exactly the same way. So firstly, let's just add some contrast and see what that looks like. And actually, I'm not doing much at the moment. I've just realized because I haven't changed the flow of my brush back up to 100%. So I'll just paint over that again so that it is having its full effect. And yeah, if we add a bit of contrast there. So I suspect if I'd changed this, actually I could have got away with a smaller adjustment because I've effectively done 1/3 of a stop here rather than 2/3 of a stop because I only painted it in 50%. So that's kind of how the flow works. But yeah, I think that adjustment for the sky here does a pretty good job of revealing that structure without artificially making anything too dark or colourful. We've actually lost quite a lot of colour around the horizon here, and I think that's related to the camera faithful profile. But you can imagine this was the most insanely saturated part of the whole scene. So actually we might take the very unusual step, for me at least, of painting in some saturation here. So forget that this is currently darkening everything because we're going to remove that. And then we're going to use the saturation slider. And you know what, we're not going to get away with much there because that's going to make the blues too strong. So let's just add a slight warming adjustment as we do that. But that does at least help along those colours and make them a bit more saturated. Maybe that's a specific area that you could go in Photoshop and do a better job of that, which is probably what I would do in this case. Finally, let's try and reveal a bit more texture in the mountain here. Incidentally, the beginner approach might be to just use the texture slider to reveal all these structures, but this looks terrible pretty quickly, as I mentioned earlier. So we're going to do that instead using the same kind of contrast and exposure adjustments that we did for other areas of the image. So I'm going to paint in the mountain here, and I'm going to paint in the mountain on the right. And again, we're not being too precise because I'm not going to make a big adjustment like this. I'm just going to add some contrast. And you see, as we add contrast, it gets darker because those are in the shadows. So we need to counteract that darkening using the exposure slider. So now what we're doing is just bringing out that texture a little bit more. And if it gets a tiny bit too blue, just add a bit of that warming adjustment in again. So exactly the same approach as I showed before, really. And by the way, I'm not cutting through this subtle haze in the middle here because this is an important characteristic of the image to generate a sense of depth. So we're going to keep that as it is. And I'm just looking at this now and I'm just trying to rationalize, is this what I want? Does this look right? Is it too bright or too dark? maybe we can just get away with a tiny bit more contrast and a tiny bit less brightness actually. I think I want to keep it a little bit darker and make sure that these colours look their best. And I think that is more or less where I'm going to finish with this file. So you can see, if I quickly speed up through all the adjustments that we just made, that actually I've used some fairly simple tools, but in a very advanced way, in that I used my ideas of what I thought the image needed to make those adjustments and an understanding of what those tools were actually doing to move them around in combination to achieve specific effects. So although the actual tools I'm using are very simple, the result is very effective. So you have a professionally, if you like, edited image, which really reveals all the potential present in the scene. And I've not tried to overcook it. I've not gone too far with saturation or anything like that, because sometimes subtlety is preferable to those richly saturated colours. So I hope you've found that helpful. If you do have any questions, please pop them in the comment box. And of course, please do like this video and follow me if you'd like to see more of this content in the future.